everybody. Well, aren't we a party bunch of New Englanders? My name is Kate Zula. I'm the educator here at the Historical Society, and I want to give you a really big thank you for coming out during today's snowstorm. And I also want to thank everyone who is joining us today virtually. One of the really nice things about the technology we have today is that we can do things hybrid. So for those of you in the room, we are also joined by a wonderful audience online. Now, I want to start today by letting you know that this is the first in a series of 4 lectures we have coming up for our Beyond the Lore lecture series. Our next one is coming up in just a couple weeks. On March 3rd, we have a virtual lecture with Wendy Bellion, who is going to be talking about her book Iconoclasm and the story of the melting of King George, both in 1776 and also in 1935. And then in April, we'll have Timothy Compow here to give his talk on Joel Stone, who was a loyalist here in Litchfield. So that lecture is called Building a Little Kingdom, and it's about Litchfield's loyalist colony in Upper Canada. And then finally, on May 3rd, we have Pete Vermillier, who many of you know, who will be back again to give his talk. This one is on Titus Minor's Revolution. And again, that's on Sunday, May 3rd. All of these lectures are in conjunction with a new exhibit that we are opening on April 18th. That is our Legends in Lore, Reconsidering Perspectives of the American Revolution. And this exhibit examines well-known stories of actions taken during the Revolution and how these tales shape our understanding of the fight for independence. We also have another exhibit opening in this gallery, and that is our One People Portraits of the Early Republic. And then Oliver Wolcott is featured heavily in both of those exhibits. So definitely come check those out. The One People one is a portraiture exhibit. And like I said, those exhibits open to the public on April 18th, but we are having a special a special preview party for everyone on Friday, April 17th. The exhibits as well as these lectures are all free as part of our mission to make the 250th commemoration as accessible to as many people as possible. But of course, donations are welcomed and encouraged. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I want to introduce our speaker for today, John Lizzi. John has taught social studies at Housatonic Valley Regional High School for the past 14 years. And at present, he lives in Burlington, Connecticut with his wife and 2 children. Lizzi has just completed his doctoral dissertation on Oliver Wolcott Jr. last year, which has served as the foundation for his new book, which will be available for sale here this afternoon, and that's Connecticut Son. His book is the first full-length biography of Wolcott's political career. So I want please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I know the weather has not been too cooperative, but I think we'll be okay. And, you know, one thing I learned from the first time I gave this talk is I probably need to pick up the pace a little bit. And hearing about some of the other presenters who are coming in the months to come, I think my topic is perhaps far more broad than some of the others. So please feel free to ask me any questions as we get to the end, and I'd be happy to answer them for you. So as we just touched on, this will work. Well, of course, that would happen right when it's done. Okay, I'll just hit the mouse. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So Wolcott Jr. has been a huge part of my life the last couple of years. I spent about a year writing my dissertation, focusing on him. And as Kate just mentioned, my interest in him came in part because of the fact that nothing really substantive had been written about him other than other dissertations. And the earliest was over 40, or rather the latest was 40 years ago. I love the early national period in American history, the 1790s. I love the politics of that period. And as I'm sure many of you have, you've read these wonderful biographies of Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, Washington, and you might notice that Wolcott is a character in those biographies, but he's often in the background. He's there, he's mentioned, it doesn't seem like he has that big a role at all. And I wanted to sort of tell that story of the 1790s and beyond from his perspective. And so that was one of my goals. I also love John Adams. And so I should say I was not well inclined to like Wolcott when I first started researching him, because if you know anything about John Adams' presidency, it's his cabinet that supposedly undermined him the entire way, and that Wolcott played a role in that. He was this lackey of Hamilton, and so he's just this mischievous character who undermined a good man, which is kind of what my belief set was going into this. But another reason why I focused on him was, in terms of my dissertation, I knew he was local, and I knew that would help me out when it came to looking at primary sources. I knew that his archive, the bulk of it is in Hartford at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. But I should say I did get a lot of help from the Litchfield Historical Society as well. There was a trove of letters between him and his brother Frederick that were really, really helpful during this private moment in his life between when he serves in the cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury to when he becomes Governor of Connecticut over 15 years later. And I should say, while there has been some written about the former regarding Wolcott, there's almost nothing on the latter with governors. That became part of my focus as well. The other quick thing on the local topic is my professors, they try to scare you when you're writing your dissertation. And they essentially say, look, if you pick a topic, you might have to travel overseas to, get access to sources. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to drive 20 minutes down the road. So that's essentially what I did. So I sought to do a political history. And one thing I would say is, for anyone that's interested in Wolcott, there are boxes and boxes of his papers. And so there's another story to tell about him beyond, I think, what I tried to cover through a political lens. And so I mentioned this. So he's a constant presence. You've seen his name. You maybe know the Wolcott name from his father, of course, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, served in the Continental Congress. His grandfather, Roger Wolcott, was also a governor of the Connecticut colony. They played an important role in his life. So the Wolcott name is out there, but not as much of a focus. So I came in with a few research questions, well, 5 of them, and I'll go through these rather quickly. And if you want me to focus on one more than the other, please let me know. So I wanted to start with his formative years. What was his life growing up, and how did that shape who he was politically? And then to what I just said, these depictions of him during the 1790s, where he is serving under Washington and Adams and their administrations, are they accurate? Is he just a background character? Is he just someone who follows orders, doesn't have any vision of his own? Or was he more impactful than that? Short answer is I thought, and I think I can prove that he was more impactful. Then he has this period of his life where he's serving as a private citizen. Almost nothing has been written about this period. What happened to him during that time? What was he doing? What did he think politically? He comes back later and he is elected governor of Connecticut after living in New York City, but he's not a Federalist at that point. He's governor under something called the Tolerationist Party. What is that? I was wondering. I never heard of that, really. And so did he actually change politically in ideology? Did he change politically, or did he essentially change parties because that better served his interests? And so we'll talk about what that was. And I think that last question was the one that drew most of my attention, what I was most fascinated by. So here's sort of the outline of what I tried to focus on, and this also reflects what became the chapters of my dissertation and in my book. So to put it all together, first goal, assess and document his contributions to American and Connecticut history based on the little that has been written about him versus what I found, and then what is the extent of his political evolution throughout his life. So let me jump into his early years. Well, as you know, he grew up in revolutionary Connecticut. We talked about his father just briefly. And so he is going to grow up in Litchfield, obviously right down the road. He is going to be educated in part at the Litchfield Law School under Tapping Reeve. And this is one of the more eye-opening moments for me in my research in reading about Tapping Reeve in the law school. One person who has done a lot of work on the law school in terms of writing said that it was a propaganda mill for the Federalist Party. So to the extent that that is true, very clearly, Wolcott is being inundated with certain messaging. And so what does the Federalist Party believe in? What does his father believe in? His father is writing him so many letters during this period in the late 1770s, early 1780s about family duty, about the idea that there is a natural aristocracy in society and that the Wolcotts are a part of it. And that essentially the young Wolcott, he has a duty to continue that, regardless of whether or not he thinks such a career in public service would be glamorous or worthwhile. He sort of has to do it because he is part of this elite class and he's best capable of doing it. So that is a big part of Federalist Party belief. In addition to a strong national government, Wolcott very early on counts himself as a nationalist. He believes in a strong central government. He believes, of course, in the independence movement and a sort of broad interpretation of the Constitution. We'll talk about that. And so things like industry and manufacturing and promoting those as well are things that he views as integral to the success of the country moving forward. But again, he has this family lineage. The Wolcotts go back to the 1630s and the founding of the colony, and they've always been present in local government, colonial and state governments. Again, his grandfather and father most prominently in their own turns as governors as well. So during this period, it's duty to family that is really driving him. So I should say some of his early jobs, he worked in the quartermaster's department during the war itself in his late teens, early 20s. And he quickly found himself doing things like accounting, bookkeeping, making sure equipment and supplies are getting to where they need to go. He's extremely talented where this is concerned. He doesn't really enjoy it, though. Later on, he is working for something called the Committee of the Pay Table during the mid-1780s, which is responsible for managing the finances of the state, looking at the state's debts post-American Revolution. And again, he has second thoughts about whether or not he wants to continue with this. Should he move into a private career? Mentioned he was at the Litchfield Law School. No evidence that he practiced law at any moment in his life, but potentially was giving some thoughts to going in that direction. And it's really his father who pushes him to stay the course, that other opportunities are going to open up to you and that you're going to find fulfillment in what you do. And those opportunities come very quickly because a couple of his friends, close friends, Jeremiah Wadsworth, Oliver Ellsworth, names you might know, recommend to the incoming Washington administration that Wolcott would be a valuable member of the Treasury Department, which is just now forming under Alexander Hamilton, of course, the first secretary of the Treasury. And at that time, the plan for the Treasury Department was 5 people. That's it, which is just a little bit smaller than the size of our cabinet departments right now. And so on his friend's recommendation, Washington and through Hamilton, they ask Wolcott if he would be interested in joining the government as auditor. And he's not so sure if this is the direction he wants to go because he thinks a lot of what he's going to be doing is very similar to what he's been doing now. He will have to move to New York City, which is the place of the first federal government. But he is convinced that this is going to be a worthwhile risk to take. And almost immediately, he is happy with his decision. And it's not necessarily because of the work that he's doing. It's because of the people he gets to be surrounded by every day. He quickly forms a very close friendship with Hamilton. And he likes being, in the midst of all of these really important conversations that are being had about what should our government look like right now. And so early on, some of the hallmark issues that the Treasury Department and Hamilton are dealing with, including the First National Bank and getting that implemented, Wolcott plays a huge role in counseling Hamilton about that. And it's very clear in their letters back and forth that Hamilton is very trusting of him. He values Wolcott's opinion. And while it would be hard for me to argue that the vision for the department is coming from Wolcott, I would say it's certainly coming mostly from Hamilton. He trusts Wolcott's opinion, and Wolcott is giving him certain ideas about how to go about things, including details about the assumption of state debts, which was a major issue at the founding as well. How do we deal with all of the debt that the state governments have? And of course, Hamilton and Wolcott's plan was that the federal government will assume the state's debt to build up the young United States' credit. And so he's involved in that as well. And very early on as well, he's kind of doing two jobs at once, because the comptroller, who was by all intents and purposes kind of the second in command of the Treasury Department. There is an assistant secretary of the Treasury, but it's really the comptroller who does the day-to-day operations and manages things. That individual gets sick and is ill constantly. And so immediately Wolcott is doing the job of really two people at once. And very soon that will allow him to transition into being the official comptroller. He gets a promotion when his predecessor unfortunately passes away. And Hamilton writes this incredible letter to Washington recommending Wolcott for the position. And it could not be filled with more laudatory compliments about Wolcott's importance to the department, essentially saying that Wolcott is more important than him almost. And the way I view it is sort of Wolcott allowed Hamilton to sort of be the public face of the Treasury Department, to, spend his time, penning, articles in the newspaper, which is something that Hamilton loved to do, while Wolcott was left to manage the day-to-day operations of the department. So you could say, maybe this is a compliment, maybe it isn't. He was a really good bureaucrat, Wolcott. And that's not a term people maybe want to be referred to today, but do you need good bureaucrats in a increasingly growing department like the Treasury, the government? And Wolcott was that. He was extremely good where that's concerned. Now, Hamilton also trusts Wolcott from a personal level as well. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Hamilton's supposed affair with Maria Reynolds. And it was Wolcott who he turned to for counsel and also to sort of be a witness when Hamilton met with James Monroe and a couple other representatives who essentially challenged Hamilton on this idea that we think you're taking bribes and that your conduct in the federal government is undermined. And of course, as you might know, Hamilton's argument that he makes in light of this affair becoming public, at least to these few individuals, is that it's nothing more than that. I'm not compromised. I was essentially being forced to pay money to her husband, but there's nothing about me, having any nefarious views, or the charges of corruption are essentially not true. And it's Wolcott who's witnessed all of that. And so that sort of suggests, again, Hamilton's trust in Wolcott. And he's a defender of Hamilton in spite of, I think, what we might agree are Hamilton not being careful with his own behavior. So around this time, Wolcott is also advising Washington and Hamilton on things like the Jay's Treaty, which is this agreement with the British government about essentially trying to prevent war, improving trade between our countries, and the conflict between the United States and France. Things are getting very tense, and between those three countries in general. And as a dedicated Federalist, Wolcott is more pro-British, of course, as is Hamilton, as is Washington. And the general thought against the Jay's Treaty is that it is way too pro-British. It's undercutting American interests at the expense of our own integrity. And that is not what Wolcott believes at all. And he believes tying America to Britain is far more important than trying to get close to France, which is what he accuses Jefferson and Madison, of course, and this growing Republican Party, which is going to be sort of his antagonist for the next 10 or so years. So he's advising on things like that. And then in 1795, early 1795, Hamilton is feeling burnt out. He's been dealing with some of these controversies of his own individually, and he decides to step down. And Wolcott, at that point, becomes the Secretary of the Treasury. And this is interesting because this is, I think, something that I sought to dispel as I learned more about Wolcott, which is there's this general contention that at this moment in Washington's presidency, he had to turn to these quote unquote second-rate individuals to be part of his cabinet. So at this point, Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of the State, has resigned over ideological reasons, really. Henry Knox, as Secretary of the War, is gone. Edmund Randolph, who had sort of his own scandal that Wolcott played a little bit of a role in getting him dismissed, is also gone. And now Hamilton is saying that he's retiring. And that's the biggest blow to Washington, of course, because you're probably aware of the closeness of their relationship. So Washington has no choice but to try to drudge up these unqualified people to serve in his cabinet. And I think Wolcott gets lumped in with that entire group. And I think that's largely incorrect. Now, if you're comparing Wolcott to Hamilton, you might say, well, Washington clearly saw that as a downgrade because of how he viewed Hamilton. But it was really Wolcott was the only choice who could possibly take over for Hamilton. And that's essentially what Hamilton said and what he said to Washington. Now, there's other individuals that are part of the story once we get into the Adams administration, names like Timothy Pickering and James McHenry, who take over as Secretary of State and Secretary of War, who I think are more justified in being characters that Washington didn't really want to have there, but no one else would take these positions. And I think Timothy Pickering was something like the 5th or 6th choice for Secretary of State. And it's noteworthy that Wolcott, for a brief moment, was under consideration for Secretary of State, which is to say that his value then sort of went far beyond just the Treasury Department. His opinions overall were valued. But the logical choice was, of course, taking over for Hamilton. And so that's what happened there. And so I sort of argue that during this period, he demonstrates his loyalty to the government, to Washington, and to Hamilton. And his belief set is all based on what he thinks is best for the country overall. That is what's dictating his behavior in his consultations with everyone and the advice that he is giving. So Washington, of course, is going to retire. And as you probably know, John Adams wins a very narrow electoral victory over Thomas Jefferson. And so this is something that Wolcott is happy about, of course. He's unsure of what his role will be under Adams in comparison to Washington. But one of the fateful decisions that's often said about Adams is he chooses to keep on the entire cabinet without making any changes. As someone who often defends Adams, I don't think there was any precedent to really get rid of your cabinet. So in hindsight, maybe was something he should have done, but in any event, he did not. And Adams is a very different president than Washington in terms of how they conduct themselves. And one of the biggest things with Adams is that he's often gone from the seat of government. He just goes home to Peacefield in Massachusetts for months at a time. Longest time was 6 months. And the cabinet officers, including Wolcott, are just kind of left in Washington, often wondering what to do or what they should be doing. And Adams is writing them letters, sort of giving instructions and things like that. He is seeking their advice and counsel, but it's not really happening in person, probably as often as it should. And so that is something that, although it pains me to say it, is something that I think maybe Adams made a mistake where that's concerned. But very quickly, early on in Adams' administration, Adams is considering sending a peace mission to France to try to quell tensions there where that's concerned. And things are highly polarized to the point where Adams' cabinet, including Wolcott, do not want any Republicans, any Jefferson associates to be on this diplomatic mission as part of that team. And that is totally antithetical to what Adams wants. Even though Adams himself is a Federalist, he would align certainly more with Wolcott probably on views and issues compared to Jefferson. Adams' bias is for the 76 generation. And so he views people like Thomas Jefferson, in spite of their ideological differences, as totally a good faith actor, in spite of, again, those differences, and someone that could be trusted. And Adams actually suggests that Jefferson should be someone to be part of this mission. And this is something that throws the cabinet into chaos. They're totally against it, including Wolcott, and they all let Adams know this. And Adams essentially backs down. Now, it should be noted that Jefferson had no interest in going anyway, and he supposedly told Adams that, which infuriated Adams and led to them not talking for essentially quite some time. But Adams, in spite of, I think, his reputation, is trying to get counsel from his cabinet. They want him to sort of all be on the same page. And at least initially on this one issue, Wolcott and Adams are far apart. Now, hitting on some other key things in the administration, we have the Alien and Sedition Acts, maybe the most important event of his presidency. And so this, of course, really restricted immigration. It also really restricted what you could say in terms of criticizing the federal government. Wolcott was a supporter of this, but not to the degree that you might think, not as much as other high Federalists. And he really wanted these acts to be used sort of sparingly. And he wanted the administration to go in some other directions in order to keep America safe from a potential war with France. So he's also supportive of some of Adams' more defensive measures. So the creation of the Department of the Navy, which Adams orchestrates. Wolcott is a supporter of this. Now, Adams gets pushed, but I think is also partially responsible for the creation of our first standing army in the country. And there's this huge controversy about who the officers of that army should be. If you know this story, Adams, without telling anyone, just appoints General George Washington as the leader of that. Doesn't tell Washington that he's appointing him. And Washington is kind of bewildered to find that out, reluctantly accepts, but Washington says, I want to pick who my officers are. And can you take a guess who he wants to be his first officer, second in command? It's Hamilton. And as you might know, Adams and Hamilton don't particularly like each other. And Adams wants to put other names forward first before Hamilton, like Henry Knox. Washington won't really budge on this. And the rest of Adams' cabinet, including Wolcott, are telling him, hey, let's just kind of let this go. Like, if you want Washington to be the leader of this, assuming that there is a war, you kind of have to let Hamilton be in charge. And so this is another example of Wolcott, I think, trying to get Adams to calm down a little bit. And something that's noteworthy about all the letters from this period is it's usually Wolcott out of the cabinet members who is sort of handpicked to write to Adams. The indication is he's the one that can best present the argument in a way that's not going to further upset Adams, let's say. He can present the arguments in the most articulate way, as opposed to someone like Timothy Pickering, who's kind of known as a bit of a hothead himself, or James McHenry, who is kind of seen as just not very good at his job as Secretary of War. So that speaks to his importance in there as well. Wolcott, though, is going to agree with Adams that the funding for the Army and how much it expands should be rather limited. And this separates Wolcott from the other high Federalist members of his department. So one of the things I found is that Wolcott and Adams are far more on the same page than I think past historians have given him credit for, who again try to just lump him in with the rest of his cabinet. So where do the charges of corruption come from? Well, Adams is going to be, and the rest of the country are going to be shocked to see that when this first diplomatic mission comes back from France, this becomes known as the XYZ affair, where Minister Talleyrand in France refused to see them. He said he wanted this huge bribe to be paid before they could even talk. And it was seen as this huge embarrassment of the American delegation and of America's pride overall. And the calls for war sort of go through the roof during this period. And they're kind of led by some of these high Federalists, like Timothy Pickering, James McHenry. Alexander Hamilton is pushing this a little bit from the sidelines, but not as much as you might think. And Wolcott, I think, is taking a more moderate approach, again, than people would give him credit for. He doesn't want to see the size of the army to go too far. He likes more of Adams' sort of defensive measures with, securing the coast, building up a navy. Adams is going to decide unilaterally, what a surprise, to send a second peace mission without anyone else really knowing about it. And this is seen as kind of a shock as well. And this sort of ruins the sort of goodwill that maybe he had earned by taking these more hawkish measures, including the Alien and Sedition Acts, including creating a standing army. And Wolcott is a reluctant supporter of this, but although he's not really sure that this is going to succeed at all. And it's at this time that Hamilton himself is very frustrated in the direction that things are going. They have a blow up against one another that happens in private at Trenton. It's depicted quite well in the John Adams HBO series, if anyone has seen that. We don't know exactly what happened because we really only have the two competing versions of that narrative of what happened. But after this blow up, where Hamilton realizes like he's not going to have any more influence over Adams at this point, he starts thinking about how can I undermine Adams' presidency? How can I make sure he is not reelected in 1800? Could there be an alternative for the Federalist Party that we can turn to? And he starts pushing Wolcott for his help on possibly getting Adams out of office. And so in their letters back and forth, and this is during 1800, he's asking Wolcott, can you send me anything, like any documents that show like our president is like unhinged, that he doesn't know what he's talking about, so that I can maybe publish something myself to defend my own character and to really convince the country why, this person is not qualified to be president anymore. And while Wolcott writes back, he often agrees with Hamilton on some of his characterization of Adams. He's unwilling to send him anything. And he's very sort of sly in the way that he responds. He doesn't really address Hamilton's ask for that directly. He just kind of ignores it and starts talking about something else in the letters. So he refuses to give anything to Hamilton or to go that far. And at this point, Hamilton starts talking about, okay, well, I want to publish this pamphlet. Like people need to know about Adams. And Wolcott counsels him against doing that. He essentially says, I think that's going to ruin your own reputation far more than it will Adams. Why don't you just let events sort of take their course? Like things are not looking too well right now where the party is concerned. Hamilton had this plan to potentially get Thomas Pinckney elected from the Federalist Party instead of Adams. He was sort of going around New England trying to get people's opinion on things like that, behind the scenes. Indications were that was not really going to work. And so as you might know about Hamilton's pamphlet that he does end up publishing, it does really end up ruining Hamilton's reputation. And so Wolcott was right about that. And perhaps he should have listened to his friend. Now, the other sort of thing that's said about Wolcott during this period that I'd like to dispel is, again, this idea about his reputation in the Adams administration. So Adams is going to end up dismissing McHenry and Pickering in these very public blow-ups, also depicted well in the Adams HBO series, but not Wolcott. So there's an obvious question there. Why not dismiss Wolcott? If he is just as guilty as the other two of going against his own administration, of working behind the scenes, then why didn't he get rid of Wolcott? And I feel like past historians have not addressed this well. And what I would say is that, for starters, only Wolcott could have managed the Treasury Department at this point. Wolcott's under a lot of stress to sort of pay for everything. The budget of the government is growing sort of exponentially during this period because there are so many preparations for war. And I also think, to what I said earlier, Wolcott was far more loyal to Adams than perhaps the other two were. And to the extent that they had disagreements, and they did, I think Wolcott was a little bit more open about them, at least having those conversations with Adams about why they disagree, where the behavior of McHenry and Pickering was a little bit more nefarious. So he was too integral, I think, to the government at this point to dismiss, and so he didn't. As you know, Adams is going to be defeated the second time around in 1800 by Jefferson, and Wolcott is wondering what becomes of him now. And he decides that he's going to resign from his post in the Treasury before the lame duck session ends. And so he sets that date at December 31st, 1800. Adams reluctantly accepts the resignation. He points out how important Wolcott was to the government. And Wolcott is sort of wondering what happens to him next. And as fate would have it, it's going to be John Adams who, at least temporarily, rescues his career, because Adams appoints him to as a federal judge as part of the Second Circuit Court, which is a new circuit court. And even though, as I said earlier, Wolcott has no experience with practicing law, and he views himself as particularly inexperienced where the law is concerned, Adams writes this letter, which I use as the introduction to one of my chapters, about how when the public doesn't acknowledge or recognize the important work that's being done by its public officials, Adams feels responsible to sort of make up for that. And so he's telling Wolcott, like, hey, I valued your work in our administration and in Washington's administration, and I don't want you to just be thrown, to the curb, essentially. And Wolcott himself has relied on a public income really his entire career. And so this letter arrives literally as he's on the carriage back to Connecticut from Washington, D.C. And he accepts. But he's only there for a couple of years because the Jefferson administration disbands that court. And so he loses his federal judgeship, which he maybe would have served in, for the remainder of his public career, given that you can serve under good conduct. And during this time, he moves to New York at the behest of his old friend, Alexander Hamilton, who is also there. And they agree to form a business partnership together. And they're going to call that business Oliver Wolcott and Company. That says something, that Wolcott's name is going to be the face of the company. I think for Hamilton, he feels like his name is too politically charged. His reputation has been damaged. Whereas Wolcott's has certainly not. Say what you will about him, even if you're, a staunch Jeffersonian, hard to say that Wolcott was not a man of integrity. And Hamilton basically says to him, look, I can raise all the capital. I have all the wealthy friends. You don't necessarily have wealth of your own, but don't worry about that. You'll be the face of the company. You'll get a great salary. And in this company, Oliver Wolcott and Company, they're going to sell stocks. They're going to do buying and selling of trade. Their second iteration of the company is going to do trade overseas in China. And they're going to be quite successful together. He's going to bring in his younger brother, Frederick, who is an important person in his life, especially during this period. And he likes living in New York City because he likes the hustle, the bustle. He likes the maritime trade. He loves the growth of manufacturing and industry that's taking place there, which he is not really privy to much back in Connecticut. Also during this period, a lot of family tragedy. So his wife is going to pass away before the age of 40, his sister as well. He also, even before this, some of his children died very young. And this was not uncommon during this period, of course. But I think it's important to mention in the context of his political journey because I think it mellows him out a bit to the extent that he, was a bit of a radical. He, was the staunch defender of these high Federalist values. I think he still retains a lot of those beliefs, but he's going to be a little bit more pragmatic in the way that he goes about it, maybe more willing to work with the other side. And as we're going to see, eventually he's not going to view the Federalist Party as the best vehicle to advance his ideas anymore. And that's going to come with the Embargo Act and the War of 1812. So the Embargo Act, as ratified or as put forth by President Jefferson, suspends all trade, really, between the United States and foreign countries. And the idea was, okay, we're not going to help France. We're not going to help Great Britain. They have this ongoing war against one another. Best thing to do is just stay out of it. Now, as you might know, this is seen as highly damaging to anyone involved in shipping. And so this really harms New England. And post 1800, it's New England that really retains the only Federalist majority in the country. And so it is deeply, deeply unpopular there. But that's not what Wolcott thinks. And he's someone involved in international trade. And he essentially makes this point. This is not a direct quote, but he says to his brother, he says, anyone that goes bankrupt as a result of the Embargo Act, they would have gone bankrupt anyway. So he essentially says, like, look, if people didn't prepare for the possibility of something like this, and you might say, well, how do you go about preparing? He writes that, like, our company is fully insured against everything, including war. So we're essentially shielded from, the pause in trade. And he says, look, this is an issue of defending our country. Extreme measures are needed, and that our national government comes first over the interests even of Connecticut or New England. And so he actually sides with the Jefferson administration on this issue against a lot of his friends in the Federalist Party. And that's taken to another level in the War of 1812, which he is a supporter of, and again, is deeply unpopular in New England. So eventually, the next president, James Madison, believes that war is ultimately necessary to defend America's interests against the British, who are seizing American ships, impressing American citizens into their navy. And so war is declared, and he supports it too for those very same reasons. And he's increasingly disillusioned with people who are calling for even secession of New England because of this issue. He views that as extremely dangerous. And he views that as a total contradiction, given that those very same people calling for secession in 1814, let's say, were adamantly against it when there were some calls of that in 1798, 1799. So Jefferson and Madison penned the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, essentially saying that states have the authority to resist the federal government when it's viewed the federal government as being unconstitutional. Those are the same arguments that those New England Federalists are making now. So he basically asks, how can you take that argument? That is a total contradiction. And so he grows disenchanted with the Federalist Party entirely at this point. And at the end of this period, 1814, he's becoming an older man at this point. He's having some health problems. And he's facing a lot of criticism for what he's been doing in New York and some of his businesses. He and Hamilton have formed their own bank as well. That gets viewed through a political lens, and he and Hamilton are attacked for that. I forgot to mention, as part of family tragedy, we can throw Hamilton's death in there as well, which occurs during this period. He takes that very hard as well. That's another thing that kind of mellows him out. And he was unaware that Hamilton was planning a duel with Burr. This was a total shock to him. But he is the one charged with managing Hamilton's estate in the aftermath, settling debts, contacting everyone. Some of the letters that he writes to Hamilton's widow, I think are worth checking out. So at the end of this period, he sort of wants to go back to Connecticut. And so that's what he plans to do. Just take a look at the clock here. Okay. So he comes home and he finds out that he has been nominated as a candidate for governor by this new tolerationist party. And he didn't really know much about that party either. And so this tolerationist party was a coalition of Republicans in Connecticut who had been the minority party really since the 1790s, but were starting to grow in strength as federalism starts to weaken after the election of 1800. Also just disaffected Federalists, including Wolcott, some other religious minorities. And I say that because Connecticut at this time is still under its original colonial charter. It's only one of two states where that is the case, Rhode Island being the other. And they have Congregationalism as its official Christian denomination, which receives benefits. And the Tolerationist Party is pushing that this needs to change. That's, one of its core issues. And just to mention some very briefly on Wolcott and his own religion, everything I saw is that his views on Christianity are very ambivalent, doesn't take any strong positions. He actually wrote an autobiography, but he never got past his teenage years. But but what he writes of his experiences with Christianity, he views hating to go to church, finds it boring, pushed to do it by his parents, and my read of that is it would have been a good time in his autobiography to say, but now and later in life, because he writes this later in life, I've changed my thoughts on that. But he doesn't include that qualifier, which leads me to believe that he never really deviated from that thought that he had maybe as a teenager. So he's appointed, or rather he's nominated, and he sort of follows this old tradition, which is I'm not going to refuse a nomination. You can put my name forward if people want me, so be it. Maybe never thought of myself as a member of this party, but I'll do it. And he is not elected in his first go around, but the Tolerationist makes huge gains in the state legislature. And on the second time around the following year, because these are one-year terms, he is elected in 1817. And he's going to preside over the ratification of a new constitution, again, replacing the colonial charter. And they're going to push forward things like voting reform, suffrage reform, which had really restricted voting to white male landowners with a lot of wealth. And it's still essentially just going to be white males, but the property and the wealth requirements are going to be dropped. And some of those, that was not necessarily a law that was enforced too strongly, but the fact that that was changed, I think, is noteworthy. Bless you. Wolcott is going to preside over this convention that sees the disestablishment of Congregationalism as the official denomination of Connecticut. So practice freedom of religion is put forward. There's also important judicial reforms, which give the judicial branch more authority. It had very little authority before the new Constitution. And so the fact that he's able to preside over this, I think is relevant. And so you might be asking, okay, why did the Tolerationists pick Wolcott? Well, he's got the Wolcott name, right? And that means something in Connecticut. He's kind of an outsider. He hasn't been in Connecticut for a while. And yet he's not really a carpetbagger, right? Because his whole family is from Connecticut. So like we can say he's not responsible for any problems our state has been having because he hasn't been in the state in 10 plus years. But he's also, this is clearly his home. And given that he has stepped out in favor of the War of 1812, which of course, after the Battle of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent is overwhelmingly popular, he's seen as a man of principle, even though he's been a Federalist his entire life. And so that's sort of why they pick him. Now, very quickly, because I know I'm running up against the clock and I want to save time for questions, he is going to serve for 10 years as governor, re-elected 9 times. Some of those elections are by overwhelming majority. Sometimes there's no one even running against him during this time. And so, especially early on, he's deeply popular. He's pushing for other reforms. One notable one is Newgate Prison in Wethersfield. Needed a total overhaul, and he was a huge advocate of that. One historian I read said it's fair to call Wolcott one of the earliest advocates of modern prison reform. He's pushing educational reform as well. Wants higher salaries for teachers, which I will stand behind as a teacher. And he's doing all of this. He's pushing these reforms, which demonstrate that he is maybe becoming a little bit more progressive, but he's staying true to some of the hallmarks of his ideology that he's held his entire life, which are the growth of industry and manufacturing. He's a big supporter of Henry Clay's American system, which is really calling for these national internal improvements, building roads and canals. He wants to see that in Connecticut as well. He does get pushback from the legislature. And unfortunately for him, the governor at this time in Connecticut it's not a particularly powerful position. And so he has to rely on the weight of his words and his influence. And so he's not always successful there. And yet, as I said earlier, he is tremendously popular during this period. Eventually, he is going to be sort of kicked out of office. So at the end of one of his terms, people assume he's running again. But members of the Tolerationist Party essentially decide that, okay, it's time to move on from Wolcott. He's getting really old now. We need new leadership. And a rumor has started that he has announced that he wants to retire. And that rumor is not really true at all. But it does sort of take hold, and he's not nominated by the party. He ends up getting put forward as an independent anyway. And he almost wins as an independent, in spite of his party essentially being entirely against him. And so he's sort of pushed away. And his last few years are a bit sad in the sense that he feels like he has to move to New York City to sort of escape what's going on in Connecticut. And his supporters, though, do put out a lot of messaging about how this is a tremendous loss for the country, or for the state rather, and that we should be thankful for the work that Wolcott did. And so to get to my last question, the big one for me, I think he did not undergo that much of a political evolution. I think his views about the country, him being a nationalist, dedicated to the Hamiltonian economic system, that remained true the entire time, in spite of this, on the surface, this big party change, abandoning the Federalist Party. And so I think he does put principles before party. I think that makes him distinct in comparison to a number of his peers. I also think what makes him distinct is that if you look at some of the other key members of the Washington and Adams administration, most of them kind of fade into obscurity after 1800. With a couple notable exceptions. If you want to say Jefferson's an exception because he was Secretary of State, okay, fine. But even someone like Hamilton, his reputation is kind of sunk after the events of the Adams administration, right? And his more direct peers, Timothy Pickering, he does become Senator of Massachusetts, but if you read about him, no one ever seems to view him, in a positive light. James McHenry fades into obscurity, Henry Knox, Edmund Randolph, other cabinet officials. So Wolcott's one of the only ones who has this sort of second career, and a very relevant one at the head of his own state. If you want to say he evolved, I think he does become more mellow and a pragmatist, as I was saying earlier. And if you want a good historical parallel that you might be familiar with, I think it's John Quincy Adams. So what's John Quincy Adams' career trajectory? Only a few years younger than Wolcott, was also a dedicated Federalist, worked in the Washington and Madison administrations, him as a diplomat. Then he also comes out and supports the Embargo Act and the War of 1812, was serving in the Senate at the time, was kicked out, abandoned by the Federalist Party, and of course has his own resurgence in the Monroe administration and then later as president. Wolcott he is one of the electors in the 1824 election. He does vote for John Quincy Adams. And so I kind of view them as very much aligned if you want that historical parallel. So all in all, I think Wolcott deserves greater recognition for his achievements, for his 40 years in public service, with this little gap in between that I think helps explain some of the shifts in his thinking. And he clearly made a huge difference, I think, at the national level and at the state level. and it's been a pleasure looking into him these last 2 years and being able to write about him and explore him as much as I did. So thank you. I would love to take any questions. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
How about his personal values and career choice?
Yeah, so the question was, what influence did Wolcott Sr. have on Wolcott Jr. in terms of his personal values? He had a tremendous influence. I sort of skipped over this a little bit in the beginning, but during the 1780s especially, this is the time period, again, when Wolcott Jr. is second guessing a lot of his career choices, whether he wants to sort of go maintain a full public career when it's not very glamorous. He is essentially kind of this bookkeeper. He's in accounting. He's very good at it. But it's his father who tells him, no, your work is very valuable. You need to keep doing it because not everyone can do it. And there are certain families in our society that need to be doing this. And the Wolcotts, they're not always going to be seen in a positive light. You might face a lot of criticism for participating in the public sphere, but that's okay because you will know that you were right in the end. And Wolcott Sr. speaks to this because he has received criticism at times. And I'll throw in Roger Wolcott, who is his grandfather. If anyone knows a little bit about him, he was sort of unceremoniously kicked out of office as governor for this Spanish ship scandal where he supposedly, after the Spanish ship crashed on Connecticut shores, he was involved in taking some of the gold away, supposedly. Not a lot of historical evidence of that is true, but essentially blamed for how he handled it. And, I think young Wolcott Jr. saw that and said, there are going to be times when I need to persevere. I need to push through. And so again, that duty, I think, is the most important thing that he took away. Of course, the push for a strong national government is something that he gets from his father as well. I think his father is even more radical where that is concerned. So, yeah.
Yeah, two questions. First of all, thank you for a great talk.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Very well researched.
Mm.
So I get listening to this that Oliver Wolcott kind of was always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Why was he never considered as a potential national candidate, either vice president or president, after all of his experience with Washington and Adams and such, and a strong Federalist? He just never seemed to perk up into those areas of consideration.
Yeah. So the question is, why didn't Wolcott maybe be seen as someone who could serve in far higher office? Well, I would say at first, he always had a very modest opinion of his own abilities. And I don't think that was something he was just saying. I think he actively believed that. And I think he did enjoy working behind the scenes far more than he did being the public face of something. Now, obviously, he does become governor of Connecticut, and so he very much is the public face at that point. But I think he honestly viewed himself as, look, Hamilton's the town. He's the vision guy. I'm the person who is going to execute the vision. And I think he really relished playing that role. And in terms of national office, like president or vice president, I think those opportunities are few and far between given his sort of where he's been. So by post 1800, is that an opportunity you want? Do you want to be the Federalist candidate for president in 1804 and 1808 when, there's not too much talk that you have a chance of winning in those cases? So
as a follow-up,
yeah.
Is it also the case that Connecticut itself, again, probably doesn't get we were so critical to the revolution and foundation and building our industries and such, but we really don't get the respect on the national stage. You have Massachusetts, you have Virginia have the big states that have all, and New York, you have those big engines of such, but you know, you don't see any early presidents or from Connecticut. You know, there's no one that really looked at Connecticut as a crucial element of our national government.
Let's see. Yeah, I agree. Connecticut doesn't often get the recognition it deserves. It's one of the most staunch supporters of the burgeoning independence movement as soon as it gets going. They're lock in step with Massachusetts really from the beginning. And in terms of sort of my focus with Wolcott and party politics of the 1790s, they are sort of the stronghold of the Federalist Party from the 1780s onward, past 1800, the election of 1800, when federalism as a party is weakening and sort of fading. It's really Connecticut along with Massachusetts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You had said that Wolcott often in his relationship with Hamilton, like Hamilton was the ideas guy and Wolcott made it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert was wondering if Wolcott modified or changed any of Hamilton's policies when he became secretary.
Mm-hmm. So the question was, did Wolcott change or modify any of Hamilton's views? Yeah, I think one good example of that is when he first gets to the Treasury and he's auditor, but also sort of serving as comptroller at the same time. Hamilton is trying to craft arguments for the First National Bank and also for the assumption of state debts. And one thing that Wolcott tries to counsel Hamilton on is the bank has a big, wide sphere in terms of what it can do and sort of where it can reach its tentacles out throughout the country. But we need to be careful with how it operates. We don't want it to engage in this rampant speculation because that's going to draw into controversy. We might cause an economic panic. And Hamilton does sort of concede to some of those ideas. Now, unfortunately, that's not going to be enough because of certain speculation, there's going to be something known as the Panic of 1792, which you could argue is a result of the bank going too far in terms of what it's doing. But yes, I think those examples are there, and that's a big one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh.
I just brought up the Toleration Party that he was the candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Did he embrace that just one religious doctrine that you talked about with Congregationalism, or did that moderate in the course of his 9 terms?
I think he embraced that from the beginning, sort of to what I suggested. So the question was, did Wolcott embrace the disestablishment of the church when he became governor? I think that was sort of contingent. Like, if you're going to be our nominee, like, this is something that at the very least you cannot speak out against. And to what I said earlier, I don't think he had too strong a position on it. It certainly wouldn't have been near the top of his issues that, like, okay, this is what I want to accomplish, I think, in my time as governor. But it's certainly something that he had no problem with, and I think probably supported more so than he didn't. So yeah, I don't think there was much of an evolution there. I think he was happy to support that from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another question from Zoom is, to what extent do you think Wolcott's personal philosophy shaped his response to economic uncertainty compared to the pressures of political expectations?
Can you repeat that? Sorry. Yeah, so there was definitely, so the question is, what's shaping Wolcott's sort of direction? Is it personal philosophy or political expectations? Certainly there was a little bit of both, and I probably undersold the latter in my presentation. I think he is very attuned to what is politically possible, and that's something that he really has to come to grips with as governor, because as I suggested, he doesn't have a strong position from which to come from, because the governor is sort of a weaker executive in our system of government at the time. But I think during the 1790s, he sort of views that everything is politically possible. The Federalists are the dominant force. They control the presidency, they control the Congress. We should really be pushing forward everything we can to increase the strength of the national government, promote industry, manufacturing, maritime trade. These are integral to the success of our country. And he sort of views like, if we're not doing that, then we're not taking advantage of the political power that we have right now. Again, I think he shifts on that because he realizes, okay, when I'm governor, I don't have this position to really push that hard. And I am ostensibly the head of this coalition that there is a wide variety of views in there. And there are some Federalists, disenchanted Federalists who are part of the Tolerationist Party. But if I just push that, I'm going to maybe sink my party. And, you know, the Federalists, as I said earlier, he doesn't view as the right vehicle to push that forward anymore. So I think he makes a conscious choice there not to support the Federalists anymore. So.
You know, I think given where we are, I'd love to wrap this up with one last question.
Sure.
Which people have been asking about, and that is, where can people tell us more about your book? Is it for sale? Where can people buy it?
Yes, I would love to answer where you can read more and about my book. So my book is for sale. It is available on Amazon. If you just put in my name or Connecticut Son, you'll find it right there on the top page. It's available in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. And I also have copies here today for anyone that might be interested. So $15 in person, and I think on Amazon the paperback is $17. So would be incredibly appreciative if anyone wants to read more. My modest contribution to understanding Wolcott's political career. And if anyone has any questions that they didn't get a chance to ask or think of later, you can always email me, and I'd be happy to get back to you, including if you read something in your book and you're like, I don't understand what you're saying there, tell me more. I'd be happy to share my thoughts. So, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.